Say something in French. I want to see if you are worth $10,000, or is that too much for you? Richard Coleman did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The weight of it carried across the table like a quiet command, and the men around him paused just long enough to register the shift before a few of them smiled into their glasses, waiting. Naomi Brooks stopped mid-step beside the table, the stem of a wine glass balanced between her fingers, her other hand steady on the tray. For a fraction of a second, her eyes flicked up, not at him, but at the reflection of the chandelier in the polished table surface, then back to the space just over his shoulder, the place she had learned to look when a guest wanted attention without acknowledgement. I can recommend a French wine if you would like, sir, she said, her voice even, professional, the cadence practiced, but there was a small delay before the last word, barely noticeable unless someone was listening for it. A low chuckle moved around the table. Richard leaned back in his chair, one arm draped over the leather, studying her now, not as part of the room, but as something he had decided to notice. No, I did not ask for a recommendation, he said, sliding a crisp bill across the table with one finger, stopping it just short of the edge. I asked if you could speak it. The bill stayed there, flat, deliberate. Naomi's grip on the tray shifted, subtle, a rebalancing, the glassware giving a faint, controlled clink. Behind her, near the service station, the floor manager had already turned his head, watching without stepping in, his posture held in that careful stillness that meant wait and see. One of the men at the table lifted his phone slightly, not enough to be obvious, just enough to frame the moment if it turned into something worth remembering. Naomi drew in a quiet breath through her nose, the kind that did not move her shoulders, and lowered the tray onto the table with precise placement, each glass aligned before she straightened again. Is there anything else I can get for you, sir? She asked, the question landing between them like a boundary she was offering. Richard smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. Just the French, he said, tapping the bill once, a soft sound against the wood. Another pause stretched, thin but noticeable now, as the surrounding tables seemed to dip in volume, without fully going silent, the room aware of something forming but not yet breaking. Naomi's gaze dropped briefly to the bill, then lifted, not to his face, but just beside it again, her expression composed, though the muscles at her jaw tightened for a beat before easing. She did not reach for the money. She did not move away. She simply stood there, the distance between them holding, the expectation hanging, and the imbalance of who could leave and who could not settling into place under the warm restaurant lights. Naomi did not move for a moment after the last word settled, not frozen, just paused in a way that felt intentional once it stretched past what most people expected. The bill remained untouched near the edge of the table, its presence oddly louder than the conversation that had begun to soften around it. One of the men cleared his throat lightly, as if to reset the rhythm, and reached for his glass, but his eyes flicked back toward Naomi before he drank. The phone lowered halfway, then lifted again, uncertain. Naomi shifted her weight to her back foot, a small adjustment that steadied her posture. Her fingers brushed once along the edge of the tray, confirming its balance even though it no longer carried anything fragile. She let her gaze pass over the table, not settling on any one face, then drew it back to a neutral point in the middle distance. I will give you a moment to decide if you would like to order anything else, she said, the words measured, neither quick nor slow, and she inclined her head just enough to mark the end of the exchange without closing it. Richard watched her, his expression unchanged, as if he had all the time in the world and expected the same from her. He did not pull the bill back, did not push it further, just left it there, a quiet marker of the space he occupied. We are not done, he said, not sharply, but with the same calm certainty, and it held her in place for a second longer than she had planned. Naomi felt that second, the way it stretched, the way it pressed at the edges of her composure. She nodded once, a small acknowledgement, and stepped back half a pace, enough to create a sliver of distance without turning away. The room around them resumed in pieces. A server at the next table placed down a plate with more care than usual, the porcelain touching linen without a sound. From the bar, a shaker rattled, then stopped abruptly, as if someone had realized it carried too far. The floor manager shifted his stance, hands coming together in front of him, but he still did not approach. Naomi's eyes dropped briefly to the bill again, not lingering, just registering its position, then lifted. "If you have a preference for a specific region or vintage, I can bring options," she offered, keeping her voice level, giving him an exit that did not require either of them to acknowledge what had just passed. Richard's lips curved slightly, the kind of smile that suggested he heard the offer and chose to ignore it. "I think I will wait," he said, leaning back a little further, his attention drifting to the others at the table as if she had already served her purpose for the moment. The men around him began to speak again, softly at first, then with more ease, though the cadence was not quite what it had been before. Naomi stood there for a beat longer, long enough to confirm that no one was adding to the order, then inclined her head once more and stepped away. She moved at the same pace she always did, not faster, not slower, but there was a slight delay in the first step, a fraction of hesitation that smoothed out by the second. As she reached the service station, she placed her empty tray down and rested her hands on the counter for a brief second, fingers spread, grounding herself in the solid surface. She exhaled quietly, not enough to draw attention, then reached for a cloth and folded it once, twice, aligning the edges with care that bordered on habit. Behind her, the low murmur of the dining room continued, but the table she had just left remained present in the space, a point of attention that had not fully dissolved. Naomi picked up a fresh set of glasses, balanced them onto her tray, and turned back toward the floor, her expression composed again, her movement steady, as if nothing had shifted, even though the air around that table still held a trace of something unresolved. Naomi stepped back onto the floor with a fresh tray balanced at shoulder height, the weight familiar, the rhythm of movement returning in pieces rather than all at once. The room had not changed, not in any visible way, but something in how it held her had. Conversations continued, glasses lifted, silverware touched porcelain, yet there was a slight delay in how people looked away when she passed, as if their attention lingered a fraction too long before returning to their own tables. She moved between chairs and low-lit corners, placing drinks where they were expected, responding to quiet requests with practiced ease, but each time she turned back toward the main aisle, her awareness drifted toward that table again, not directly, never fully, just enough to feel its presence. Richard Coleman's voice carried intermittently, calm, measured, threading through the ambient noise without competing with it. He spoke as though nothing had shifted, as though the moment earlier had already resolved itself into something unimportant. The men around him followed his lead, their laughter returning in smaller bursts, a little tighter at the edges, but still present. Naomi approached a nearby table, setting down 2 glasses of sparkling water. Her hand paused for half a second before releasing the second glass, the base hovering just above the linen before settling. The guest noticed, not the pause itself, but the care in it, and gave a small nod that Naomi returned automatically. When she straightened, her gaze moved past the guest's shoulder and briefly aligned with one of the men from Richard's table. He looked away quickly, but not before the connection registered, a silent acknowledgement that he had been watching. Naomi shifted her stance, redistributing her weight, and turned back toward the service path. At the edge of the room, near the bar, she reached for a folded napkin and adjusted the placement of cutlery on an empty setting, even though it did not need correcting. The motion was precise, deliberate, a way to steady the pace of her hands. Behind her, the bartender resumed a gentle rhythm with the shaker, softer now, more contained. Naomi picked up another order slip, scanned it, and began moving again. As she passed within a few feet of Richard's table, she did not stop, but the proximity altered the air. One of the men leaned back slightly in his chair, giving her space that she had not asked for. Another lifted his glass but did not drink, his eyes tracking her movement for a second longer than necessary. Richard did not look at her this time. He reached for his glass, took a measured sip, and set it down with controlled precision, his attention fixed on the conversation as if the earlier exchange had already been categorized and set aside. Naomi felt the pull of that table as she moved beyond it, a subtle drag in her pace that she corrected by the next step. She kept her shoulders level, her gaze forward, but there was a moment, brief and contained, where her focus narrowed, the surrounding noise dimming just enough for her to notice the quiet in her own breathing. At the service station, she set the tray down and picked up a fresh one, aligning the glasses with careful symmetry. Her fingers adjusted one stem by a fraction of an inch, then another, until the arrangement matched the internal order she relied on. The floor manager passed behind her, close enough for her to register his presence without turning. He did not speak, did not pause, but his pace slowed slightly as he moved on, as if marking the moment without interrupting it. Naomi lifted the tray again, the weight settling into her hand, and stepped back into the dining room. This time, her movement was more even, the earlier hesitation less visible, though not entirely gone. As she crossed the room, the glances from nearby tables softened, not disappearing, but losing their sharp edge. Still, the space around Richard's table remained distinct, a quiet center of gravity she could feel without looking. She adjusted her path by a few inches to avoid passing too close again, a small deviation that no one would notice, but one that allowed her to maintain the rhythm she needed. The room continued around her, steady, composed, yet carrying the faint imprint of something that had not fully settled, held in the pauses between words, in the way attention returned just a little slower than before. Naomi crossed back toward the center aisle with a tray of fresh glasses, her pace steady, her posture unchanged, but the awareness of that table remained just beneath the surface of each step. As she neared, one of the men at Richard's table lifted his hand slightly, not quite a call, more a signal that could be ignored if she chose. Naomi slowed, just enough to acknowledge it, then stepped closer, stopping at the edge of the table with the same measured distance she had kept before. "Another round," the man said, glancing briefly at Richard before looking back at her. Naomi inclined her head, her eyes moving across the table, registering the nearly empty glasses, the placement of cutlery, the bill still resting where it had been left, untouched. Her hand shifted under the tray, adjusting the weight, and for a brief second, her fingers tightened around the edge, a small, contained pause that did not belong to her usual rhythm. She set the tray down beside her, reaching for the first glass, replacing it with a clean one, then the second. The movement was precise, practiced, but when her hand passed near the bill, she hesitated, just a fraction longer than necessary, the space around it holding a different kind of attention. She straightened slightly, her gaze lifting, not to Richard, but to the table as a whole, and then, instead of leaving the bill where it was, she picked it up between two fingers and placed it gently back toward him, aligning it near his hand rather than at the edge. The motion was small, almost incidental, but it shifted the balance of the moment in a way that could not be undone. The table went quiet for a beat, not fully silent, but enough that the absence of sound registered. One of the men leaned forward slightly, his glass hovering midair. The phone that had been half-raised lowered completely now. Richard's eyes moved to the bill, then to Naomi's hand, then up, finally meeting her gaze. Directly for the first time since she had returned. He did not reach for the money immediately. Instead, he adjusted his position in the chair, a subtle straightening, his shoulders settling into a more deliberate posture. "I did not say you could move that," he said, his voice even, controlled, but the edge was there now, not louder, just sharper. Naomi's hand remained where it had just left the bill for a second longer, then withdrew smoothly, returning to the tray. "I did not want it to fall, sir," she replied, her tone steady, the words simple, offering a reason without adding anything more. There was a slight tightening at the corner of her mouth that she released as she reached for the next glass. Richard watched her for another second, then reached forward and tapped the bill once with his finger, pulling it back an inch, closer to himself, re-establishing its position on his terms. The movement was small, but it carried the weight of correction. Around the table, the men shifted, one clearing his throat again, another setting his glass down more carefully than before. The conversation did not resume immediately this time. Naomi continued her work, replacing the remaining glasses, her hands steady again, though the first movement back to the tray came a fraction slower than the others. When she finished, she lifted the tray, her grip firm, and inclined her head once more. She did not step away immediately. There was a brief pause, just long enough to confirm there were no further requests, but also long enough to hold the space she had just altered. Richard leaned back again, though not as far as before, his gaze shifting away from her, returning to the table, but with a different kind of focus now, more deliberate, more contained. "That will be all," he said, dismissing her without looking up. Naomi nodded, turning with controlled precision, her first step away measured, her second more fluid, the rhythm returning in layers. As she moved back toward the service station, the air behind her felt heavier, the attention from nearby tables lingering longer than before, not sharp, but present. She set the tray down, her fingers releasing it carefully, and for a brief moment, her hand rested on the edge again, grounding herself before she reached for the next task, her posture settling back into place, though the space she had just shifted did not fully return to what it had been. Naomi had just set a fresh bottle of still water onto a nearby table when she heard the shift before she saw it, a slight drop in surrounding noise that did not belong to any single action, just a collective pause spreading outward. She turned, not quickly, but with the same controlled pace she had maintained all evening, and found Richard already looking at her, his hand resting lightly on the table, fingers near the edge of the bill he had reclaimed. "Come back," he said, not loudly, but clearly enough that the space between tables carried it without distortion. Naomi adjusted the angle of the tray in her hand, her fingers tightening briefly against the metal underside before easing, and stepped toward him again, each step measured, even though the distance felt longer than before. When she reached the table, she stopped in the same place she had earlier, not closer, not farther, holding the boundary that had already been tested. Richard did not look at her immediately. He picked up his glass, took a slow sip, then set it down with deliberate care, aligning it with the edge of his plate. Only then did he shift his attention back to her. "You were not finished," he said, his tone calm, as if correcting a minor oversight rather than reopening anything. One of the men at the table leaned back, folding his arms, his gaze fixed between them. Another tilted his head slightly, watching without pretending otherwise now. Naomi felt the weight of those eyes settle, not sharp, but focused, waiting. Her hand moved once along the rim of the tray, a small adjustment that took longer than it needed to, then stilled. "Was there something else you would like, sir?" she asked, the words landing evenly, though her voice carried a slight delay on the final word, just enough to mark the pressure beneath it. Richard's lips curved faintly, not quite a smile. "Yes," he said, tapping the table once with his finger, then lifting his hand and gesturing lightly toward the open space in front of him. "I would like you to answer properly this time." The gesture was casual, but it directed the attention of the entire table toward that single spot, toward her, toward the expectation that had been left unresolved. The man with the phone did not lift it again, but his hand hovered near it, as if ready. Naomi did not move immediately. There was a brief pause, contained, but visible in the way her shoulders held for a second longer before settling. Her eyes lowered to the table, not to the bill this time, but to the space Richard had indicated, then lifted again, not quite meeting his gaze, but close enough to register presence. The room around them thinned, not silent, but narrowed, conversations at nearby tables softening as attention drifted inward. Even the bartender's movement slowed, the faint clink of glass against glass spaced farther apart. Richard leaned back slightly, giving her space that felt less like permission and more like a stage. "We are all waiting," he added, his voice still even, but now carrying a deliberate patience that extended the moment rather than resolving it. Naomi shifted her weight, the tray lowering a fraction in her hand before she corrected it, bringing it back to level. Her fingers tightened briefly around the edge, then loosened. She drew in a quiet breath, her chest rising just enough to mark it, then released it slowly. For a second, nothing happened. The expectation held, stretching, the seconds accumulating in a way that made them noticeable. One of the men at the table cleared his throat, then stopped himself, the sound cutting short. Naomi's gaze moved once across the table, taking in the faces, the posture, the stillness, then returned to the space in front of her. Her lips parted slightly, then closed again, a small interruption in her usual rhythm, before she finally spoke, her voice controlled, measured, carrying just enough to reach the table without extending beyond it. "Sir," she began, then paused again, not losing composure, but adjusting it, choosing the next step with care that could be seen in the timing. Richard did not interrupt. He watched, his expression unchanged, his attention fixed, holding the moment open, not allowing it to pass without completion. Naomi's hand shifted once more on the tray, the metal giving a faint, soft sound under her grip, and then she steadied it, her posture aligning, her presence settling back into itself even as the pressure remained fully in place, unbroken, waiting for what she would do next. Naomi's voice did not continue after that first word. It settled instead into the space between them, unfinished but not withdrawn, as if she had placed it there deliberately and was allowing it to exist without rushing to complete it. Her hand adjusted again on the tray, not to correct its balance, but to give her fingers something to hold on to, the metal cool against her palm. The room held its breath in a way that was not obvious unless someone listened for it. The background sounds still present, but spaced farther apart, each clink and murmur arriving with a slight delay, like echoes in a larger room. Richard did not move. His eyes remained on her, steady, patient, not pressing, not pulling back, simply holding the moment open. One of the men shifted in his chair, the soft scrape of wood against the floor louder than it should have been, then stilled again. Naomi's gaze drifted once more, not away, but across the table, tracing the edges of glasses, the alignment of silverware, the small details that anchored her in something concrete. Her shoulders rose a fraction with a quiet breath, then lowered, the movement controlled, measured, as if she were matching her pace to something internal rather than the room around her. The tray dipped slightly again, barely noticeable, and she corrected it without looking down, her posture settling back into place. No one spoke. Even the nearby tables seemed to pause at the edges of their conversations, voices softening, sentences left incomplete, attention not fully shifting away. Richard leaned back just enough to change the angle of his view, but not enough to break his focus, his hand resting lightly on the table, fingers still, no longer tapping. Naomi's eyes lifted again, closer this time, almost meeting his, then stopping just short, her expression composed. Though the timing of her movements carried a slight lag, a human hesitation that had not been there earlier in the night. She did not step back. She did not step forward. She remained exactly where she was, holding the space she had been given, or perhaps the space she had taken, the distinction unclear but present. The silence stretched, not empty, but filled with the weight of what had not yet been said. A glass somewhere in the room was set down too quickly, the sound sharper than expected, then followed by a quieter adjustment, as if someone had realized it had carried too far. Naomi's fingers shifted again, this time releasing a small amount of tension, her grip loosening just enough to allow a faint breath to pass through her posture. She blinked once, slowly, then steadied her gaze again, not avoiding, not confronting, simply present. Richard's expression did not change. He watched, his attention unwavering, as if the length of the silence itself was part of the test, part of the control he maintained without raising his voice or altering his tone. The men around him remained still, their earlier ease replaced by a quieter observation, their bodies angled toward the center of the table, toward Naomi, toward the moment that refused to resolve. Naomi's lips parted slightly again, then closed, not in retreat, but in adjustment, as if she were choosing the exact point at which to move next. Her shoulders settled once more, lower now, the tension redistributing rather than disappearing. If you are still here, you can feel how quiet the room has become. You can feel this pause too. And if it draws you in, consider subscribing and turning on notifications, and let me know where you are watching from and what time it is for you right now. The air remained still, the expectation intact, the moment suspended without breaking, each second adding weight rather than release. As Naomi stood in place, composed but not untouched, and Richard continued to wait, not with impatience, but with certainty that the silence would eventually belong to him unless she chose otherwise. Naomi did not raise her voice when she spoke again, but this time the words did not stop halfway. They moved forward, clear and measured, in fluent French, not rehearsed, not broken into simple phrases, but structured, deliberate, carrying the rhythm of someone who understood more than just the language itself. She did not look around the table as she spoke, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, the tray still balanced in her hand. The sentence was not long, but it was precise, and when she finished, the silence that followed was different from the one before. It did not stretch. It landed. One of the men at the table blinked, then shifted forward, his attention sharpening in a way that had not been there earlier. Another set his glass down slowly, the motion controlled, his eyes moving from Naomi to Richard and back again. At the far end of the table, a man who had barely spoken all evening straightened in his chair, his expression tightening slightly, as if he had just caught something others had missed. He spoke in English, his voice cutting cleanly through the quiet. "That is not what the clause says." The words redirected the moment instantly. He reached for his tablet, pulling it closer, tapping the screen with quick, precise movements, then turned it toward Richard. "She is right. The liability shifts after the second condition, not the first." The screen reflected the overhead light as he pointed to a specific line, his finger steady, the detail clear. The reaction spread across the table in small, visible shifts. One man leaned in, another adjusted his seat, their attention no longer on Naomi as a server, but on the document now between them. Richard did not move at first. His hand remained on the table, fingers still where they had been, but his eyes dropped to the tablet, scanning, pausing, then narrowing slightly. The calm control he had held all evening hesitated, not breaking, but no longer smooth. He reached forward, pulling the tablet closer to himself, his posture changing as he read, the angle of his shoulders turning inward, focused. The bill on the table remained where he had left it, no longer the center of attention. Naomi stood exactly as she had been, her hands steady on the tray, her gaze neutral, not following the tablet, not seeking confirmation. She had already stepped back into stillness before the reaction fully formed. Around them, the room shifted again, not with noise, but with a subtle release of tension that moved outward in quiet waves. The bartender resumed a steadier rhythm, the soft clink of glass returning to its earlier pattern. At nearby tables, conversations restarted, tentative at first, then more natural, though a few glances still drifted back toward the scene. Richard exhaled once, not loudly, but enough to mark the moment, and set the tablet down with more force than he had used for anything else that evening. He did not look at Naomi immediately. Instead, he adjusted his position in the chair, straightening fully now, his earlier ease replaced by something more deliberate. When he finally lifted his gaze, it did not pass over her this time. It landed directly. For a brief second, he said nothing. Then his hand moved toward the bill, not to push it forward, not to reclaim it, but to rest on it, as if reconsidering what it represented. The table remained quiet. The earlier dynamic altered in a way that could not be ignored. Naomi inclined her head slightly, the same professional gesture she had used all night, and turned just enough to step away, her movement smooth, controlled, unchanged, even as the space behind her no longer held the same weight it had before. Naomi did not hurry as she stepped away from the table, her pace the same as before, the tray still balanced at shoulder height, but the space behind her did not settle back into its earlier shape. At the table, no one resumed speaking immediately. The man with the tablet kept it turned slightly toward the center, his fingers still resting near the line he had pointed out, as if holding the place. Another man reached for his glass, then paused midair, setting it back down without drinking. Richard remained still for a second longer, his hand resting on the bill. Then he lifted it, not with the casual ease from before, but with a slower motion, folding it once between his fingers instead of leaving it flat on the table. He did not push it forward again. He set it beside his plate, aligned with the edge as if it belonged there now rather than between them. Naomi reached the service station and set her tray down, the metal touching the surface with a controlled, quiet sound. Her hands moved immediately to adjust the glasses, aligning them in a straight row, though they were already evenly placed. Behind her, the floor manager approached, then slowed, stopping just short of speaking, his eyes flicking past her toward the table before he turned away again. Naomi picked up a fresh cloth and folded it once, then placed it beside the glasses, her movement steady, unchanged. Back at the table, Richard leaned forward slightly, his attention still on the document, but the angle of his body had shifted, no longer relaxed, no longer performing for the others. "Check the second section again," he said, his voice lower, directed more toward the man with the tablet than the group. The man nodded quickly, tapping the screen again, scrolling with focused precision. Another leaned in closer now, their chairs moving a fraction inward, closing the space between them. The earlier distance, The casual spread of the table tightened into something more concentrated. Naomi lifted a new tray, this time with 2 glasses and a bottle, and stepped back onto the floor. As she moved, the glances that followed her were different, less lingering, more measured, as if recalibrating rather than observing. When she passed near the table again, no one called her over. No hand lifted, no voice signaled. The attention remained on the document, on the discussion that had shifted direction. One of the men looked up briefly as she passed, his eyes meeting hers for a moment. Then he gave a small nod before returning to the table. It was quick, almost incidental, but it did not match the way they had looked at her earlier. Naomi continued without pause, delivering the glasses to another table, placing each one with the same care as before. Her hand did not hesitate this time. The rhythm of her movement had settled, not faster, not slower, but more even, the earlier interruptions smoothed out. At Richard's table, he picked up his glass again, but instead of leaning back, he remained forward, his elbow resting lightly near the tablet, his focus anchored there. He took a sip, then set the glass down without looking away from the screen. The bill remained untouched beside his plate. The room adjusted around this shift. Conversations resumed more fully now, the earlier tension dispersing into quieter pockets, though a subtle awareness lingered. The bartender's movements returned to a steady cadence, the clink of glass more regular. Naomi crossed the room again, her path no longer avoiding the table, but not drawn to it either, simply moving through the space as it was. As she passed the edge of Richard's table once more, he did not look up, did not call her back, but his hand moved slightly, not toward the bill, not toward the tray, just a small adjustment on the table, as if the space he occupied had changed shape and he was still finding where to place himself within it. Naomi continued forward, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, the shift behind her no longer needing her to hold it in place. Naomi continued through the dining room with the same steady pace, her tray balanced, her movements consistent, as if the earlier shift had already settled into something ordinary. At Richard's table, the discussion narrowed into short, focused exchanges, voices lower, no longer drifting outward. The tablet remained between them, passed once, then returned to the center. One man nodded, another adjusted his chair closer, their attention fixed on the document rather than anything beyond it. Richard sat forward, his posture held in a way that no longer suggested control over the room, but concentration within it. After a moment, he reached for the folded bill beside his plate. He did not look at it immediately. His fingers turned it once, then he unfolded it carefully, smoothing it flat against the table. He paused, then reached into his jacket, pulling out a card, placing it beside the bill without comment. The motion was deliberate, unhurried, and when he lifted his hand away, he did not draw attention to it. He simply left both there, aligned side by side. Naomi approached the table again, this time to clear a glass that had been pushed slightly aside. No one called her. No one tested her. As she reached for the glass, Richard's hand moved once, not to stop her, but to slide the bill and the card a few inches toward her side of the table. The movement was small, but clear, and it was the first time he had directed something toward her without making it a condition. Naomi's hand paused briefly above the glass, then completed the motion, lifting it from the table. She did not reach for the money immediately. She set the glass onto her tray, then with the same measured precision, she picked up the bill and the card together, placing them on the tray without looking down. She inclined her head slightly, the same gesture she had used all evening, unchanged in tone or meaning. Richard did not speak. He did not lean back. He simply gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, his attention returning to the tablet as if the action had already concluded. Around them, the room continued to return to its usual rhythm. Conversations resumed fully, the earlier pauses fading into the background. The bartender worked at a steady pace again, the sound of glass and metal blending into the low hum of the space. The floor manager moved past without slowing this time, his focus elsewhere. Naomi stepped away from the table, her pace even, her posture unchanged. As she reached the service station, she set the tray down and separated the bill from the card, placing the card into the payment folder and the bill into the register drawer without hesitation. Her hands moved with the same consistency as before, no faster, no slower. When she turned back toward the dining room, The table no longer held the same weight. It was just another table, occupied, active, but no longer the center of the room. Naomi picked up a clean tray and stepped forward again, her movement steady. The space around her fully returned to its balance. If this moment stayed with you, share what you felt and consider subscribing and turning on notifications for more stories like this. Thank you.